The Battle of Chrysler's Farm, also known as the Battle of Chrysler's Field, was fought on the 11th of November 1813, during the Anglo-American War of 1812. A British and Canadian force won a victory over a U.S. force which greatly outnumbered them. The U.S. defeat prompted them to abandon the St. Lawrence campaign, their major strategic effort in the autumn of 1813. St. Lawrence campaign. The American plan. The battle arose from a United States military campaign which was intended to capture Montreal. The resulting military actions, including the Battle of the Chateauguay, the Battle of Chrysler's Field and a number of skirmishes, are collectively known as the St. Lawrence Campaign. The U.S. plan was devised by United States Secretary of War John Armstrong, Jr., who originally intended taking the field himself, because it was difficult to concentrate the necessary force in one place due to the initially scattered disposition of the troops and inadequate lines of communication. It involved two forces which would combine for the final assault. Major General James Wilkinson's division of 8,000 would concentrate at Sacketts Harbor on Lake Ontario, and proceed down the St. Lawrence River in gunboats, bateaux, and other small craft. At some point, they would rendezvous with another division of 4,000 under Major General Wade Hampton advancing north from Plattsburgh on Lake Champlain, to make the final attack on Montreal. Even as preparations proceeded, it was apparent that the plan had several shortcomings. Until the last minute, it was uncertain that Montreal was to be the objective, as Armstrong originally intended to attack Kingston, where the British Naval Squadron on Lake Ontario was based. However, Commodore Isaac Chauncey, commanding the U.S. Navy Squadron on the lake, refused to risk his ships in any attack against Kingston. There was mistrust between the U.S. Army officers concerned. Wilkinson had an unsavory reputation as a scoundrel, and Hampton originally refused to serve in any capacity in the same army as Wilkinson. The troops lacked training and uniforms, sickness was rife, and there were too few experienced officers. Chiefly, though, it appeared that neither force could carry sufficient supplies to sustain itself before Montreal, making a siege or any prolonged blockade impossible. American preliminary moves. Hampton began his part of the campaign on the 19th of September with an advance down the River Richelieu, which flows north from Lake Champlain. He decided that the defenses on this obvious route were too strong and instead shifted westward to Four Corners, on the Chateauguay River near the frontier with Canada. He was forced to wait there for several weeks as Wilkinson's force was not ready, which cost him some of his initial advantage in numbers as Canadian troops were moved to the Chateauguay, and reduced his supplies. Armstrong had intended that Wilkinson's force would set out on the 15th of September. On the 2nd of September, Wilkinson himself had gone to Fort George, which the Americans had captured in May, to arrange the movement of Brigadier General John Parker Boyd's division from Fort George to rendezvous with the troops from Sacketts Harbor. Possibly because he was ill, he delayed around Fort George for nearly a month. He returned to Sacketts Harbor, and Boyd's division began its movement only in the first week in October. The poor prospects for success led Armstrong to abandon his intention of leading the final assault himself. He handed over all command of the expedition to Wilkinson and departed Sacketts Harbor on his way to Washington on the 16th of October, just before Wilkinson's part of the campaign was at large launched. Armstrong's letter to Hampton, notifying him of the change in command and also throwing much of the burden of supplying the combined force onto him, arrived the evening before Hampton's army fought the Battle of the Chateauguay. Although Hampton nevertheless attacked, as part of his force was already committed to an outflanking move, he immediately sent his resignation, and fell back when his first attack was repulsed. Wilkinson's moves. Wilkinson's force left Sacketts Harbor on the 17th of October, bound at first for Grenadier Island at the head of the St. Lawrence. Mid-October was very late in the year for serious campaigning in the Canadas, and the American force was hampered by bad weather, losing several boats and suffering from sickness and exposure. It took several days for the last stragglers to reach Grenadier Island. On the 1st of November, the first boat set out from the island, and reached French Creek on the 4th of November. Here, the first shots of the campaign were fired. British brigs and gunboats under Commander William Mulcaster had left Kingston to rendezvous with an escort bateau and canoes carrying supplies up the St. Lawrence. The aggressive Mulcaster bombarded the American anchorages and encampments during the evening. The next morning, American artillerymen under Lieutenant Colonel Moses Porter drove him away, using hastily heated hot shot. From French Creek, Wilkinson proceeded down the river. On the 6th of November, while at the settlement of Hogues, he received the news that Hampton had been repulsed at the Chateauguay River on the 26th of October. He sent fresh instructions to Hampton to march westward from his present position at Four Corners, New York, and meet him at Cornwall. Wilkinson's force successfully bypassed the British post at Prescott late on the 7th of November. The troops were disembarked and marched around Ogdensburg on the south bank of the river, while the lightened boats ran past the British batteries under cover of darkness and poor visibility. Only one boat was lost, with 2 killed and 3 wounded. The next day, while the main body re-embarked, an advance guard battalion commanded by Colonel Alexander Macomb and a battalion of riflemen under Major Benjamin Forsyth were landed on the Canadian side of the river to clear the riverbank of harassing Canadian militia. On the following day, Wilkinson held a council of war. All his senior officers appeared to be determined to proceed with the expedition, regardless of the difficulties and alarming reports of enemy strength. The advance guard was reinforced with the 2nd Brigade under Brigadier General Jacob Brown, who took command of the force, and marched eastward along the northern bank of the river. Before the main body could follow by water, Wilkinson learned that a British force was pursuing him. He landed almost all the other troops as a rearguard, under Brigadier General John Parker Boyd. Late on the 10th of November, after a day spent marching under intermittent fire from British gunboats and field guns, Wilkinson set up his headquarters in Cook's Tavern, with Boyd's troops bivouacked in the woods around. British countermoves. The British had been aware of the American concentration at Sackett's Harbor, but for a long time they had believed, with good reason, that their own main naval base at Kingston was the intended target of Wilkinson's force. Major General Francis de Rottenberg, the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, had massed his available troops there. When Mulcaster returned from French Creek late on the 5th of November with news that the Americans were heading down the St. Lawrence, de Rottenberg dispatched a corps of observation after them, in accordance with orders previously issued by Governor-General Sir George Prevost. The corps initially numbered 650 men, and was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Wanton Morrison, the commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion, the 89th Regiment. They were embarked in the schooners Beresford and So Sidney Smith, accompanied by 7 gunboats and several small craft, all commanded by Mulcaster. They departed from Kingston in thick weather late on the 7th of November and evaded the ships of Commodore Isaac Chauncey, which were blockading the base among the Thousand Islands at the head of the St. Lawrence River. On the 9th of November, they reached Prescott, where the troops disembarked as the schooners could proceed no farther. Morrison was reinforced by a detachment of 240 men from the garrison of Prescott, to a total strength of about 900 men. Marching rapidly, they caught up with Boyd's rearguard on the 10th of November. That evening they encamped near Chrysler's farm, 2 miles upstream from the American positions. The terrain was mainly open fields, which gave full scope to British tactics and musketry, while the muddy ground and the marshy nature of the woods surrounding the farm would hamper the American maneuvers. Morrison was keen to accept battle here if offered. battle. As dawn broke on the 11th of November, it was cold and raining, though the rain later eased. Firing broke out in two places. On the river, Milcaster's gunboats began shooting at the American boats clustered around Cook's Point, while a Mohawk fired a shot at an American party scouting near their encampment, who replied with a volley. Half a dozen Canadian militia dragoons bolted back to the main British force, calling that the Americans were attacking. The British force dropped its half-cooked breakfast and formed up, which caused American sentries to report that the British were attacking, and forced the Americans in turn to form up and stand to arms. At about 10:30 in the morning, Wilkinson received a message from Jacob Brown, who reported that the previous evening he had defeated 500 Stormanton Glengarry militia at Hooples Creek and the way ahead was clear. To proceed, however, the American boats would next have to face the Long Sault Rapids, and Wilkinson determined to drive Morrison off before tackling them. He himself had been ill for some time, and could not command the attack himself. His second-in-command, Major General Morgan Lewis, was also indisposed. This left Brigadier General Boyd in command. He had immediately available the 3rd Brigade under Brigadier General Leonard Covington and the 4th Brigade under Brigadier General Robert Swarto out, with two 6-pounder guns. Some distance downriver were part of Boyd's own 1st Brigade under the brigade's second-in-command, Colonel Isaac Coles. 4 more 6-pounder guns and a squadron of the 2nd U.S. Dragoons. In all, Boyd commanded perhaps 2,500 men. British dispositions. The British were disposed in echelon, with their right wing thrown forward, lining a ravine close to the American positions, and in the woods on the left was the skirmish line under Major Frederick Heriot of the Canadian Voltigeurs, consisting of 3 companies of the Voltigeurs and around 24 Mohawks from Tyndonnaga under interpreter Lieutenant Charles Anderson. The right wing was part of the detachment from Prescott under its commandant, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Pearson. It consisted of the flank companies of the 49th Regiment and a detachment of the Canadian Fencibles with a 6-pounder gun of the Canadian Provincial Artillery. They occupied some buildings on the river bank near the Americans, with a small gully protecting their front. Behind their left flank were 3 companies of the 289th under Captain G. W. Barnes. Behind Barnes's left flank in turn was the British main body, the centre companies of the 49th under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Plenderleith on the right and 6 companies of the 289th on the left under Morrison himself. Morrison himself stated that he disposed 1 each of his 3 6-pounder guns to support each of his 3 detachments. However, various sources state that while the militia gun was posted with Pearson, the 2 6-pounder guns of the Royal Artillery under Captain H. G. Jackson occupied a small hillock behind the 49th, and fired over their heads during the engagement. Action. Boyd did not order an assault until the middle of the afternoon. On the American right, the 21st U.S. Infantry under Colonel Eleazar Wheelock Ripley advanced and drove the British skirmish line back through the woods, for almost a mile. Here they paused to draw breath, and were joined by the 12th and 13th U.S. Infantry from Cullis Brigade. Ripley and Coles resumed their advance along the edge of the woods, but were startled to see a line of redcoats rise up out of concealment and open fire. The American soldiers dived behind tree stumps and bushes to return fire, and their attack lost all order and momentum. As ammunition ran short, they began to retreat out of line. Meanwhile, Covington's brigade struggled across the ravine and deployed into line, under musket and shrapnel fire. Legend has it that at this point, Covington mistook the battle-hardened 49th Regiment in their grey greatcoats for Canadian militia and called out to his men, "Come on, my lads, let us see how you will deal with these militiamen." A moment later, he was mortally wounded. His second-in-command took over, only to be killed almost immediately. The brigade quickly lost order and began to retreat. Boyd could not bring all his 6 guns into action until his infantry were already falling back. When they did open fire from the road along the river bank, they were quite effective. Morrison's second-in-command, Lieutenant Colonel John Harvey, ordered the 49th to capture them. The 49th made a charge in awkward echelon formation, suffering heavy casualties from the American guns as they struggled across several rail fences. The United States Dragoons now intervened, charging the exposed right flank of the 49th. The 49th halted their own advance, reformed line from echelon formation and wheeled back their right. Under heavy fire from the 49th, Pearson's detachment and Jackson's 2 guns, the Dragoons renewed their charge twice but eventually fell back, leaving 18 casualties. They had bought time for all but one of the American guns to be removed. Barnes's companies of the 289th overtook the 49th and captured the one gun which had become bogged down and been abandoned. It was now about 4:30. Almost all of the American army was in full retreat. The 25th U.S. Infantry under Colonel Edmund P. Gaines and the collected boat guards under Lieutenant Colonel Timothy Upham held the ravine for a while, but Pearson threatened to get round their left flank, and they too fell back. As it was growing dark and the weather was turning stormy, the British halted their advance. The American army meanwhile retreated in great confusion to their boats and crossed to the south bank of the river. Although the British did not stand down from battle stations for some time, wary of the Americans renewing the attack. An American witness stated that 1,000 American stragglers had made their way across the river during the battle itself. Casualties. Although the British casualties were reported in Morrison's dispatches as 22 killed, 148 wounded and 9 missing, it has been demonstrated that a further 9 men were killed and an additional 4 men were missing, giving a revised total of 31 killed, 148 wounded and 13 missing. The American casualties, from the official return, were 102 killed, and 237 wounded including Brigadier General Leonard Covington. No figures were given for men missing or captured, but the official return notes that 3 of the 16 officers listed as wounded were also captured. The number of American prisoners taken was initially reported as upwards of 100 by Morrison, but he wrote that more were still being brought in. The final tally was 120. Most of these were severely wounded men who had been left on the field, but 14 unwounded enlisted men were captured after trying to hide in a swamp. A Canadian who rode across the battlefield on the morning of the 12th of November remembered it being covered with Americans killed and wounded. Aftermath. On the 12th of November, the sullen American flotilla successfully navigated the Long Sault Rapids. That evening, they reached a settlement known as Barnhart's, 3 miles above Cornwall, where they rendezvoused with Brown's detachment. There was no sign of Hampton's force, but Colonel Henry Atkinson, one of Hampton's staff officers, brought Hampton's reply to Wilkinson's letter of the 6th of November. Hampton stated that shortage of supplies had forced him to retire to Plattsburgh. Wilkinson used this as pretext to call another council of war, which unanimously opted to end the campaign. The defeat of American forces at the Battle of Chrysler's Farm on October 26, at the Battle of the Chateauguay ended the American threat to Montreal in the late fall of 1813, and with it the risk that Canada would have been cut into 2 parts. The army went into winter quarters at French Mills, 7 miles from the St. Lawrence, but the roads were almost impassable at this season, and Wilkinson was also forced by lack of supplies and sickness among his army to retreat to Plattsburgh. He was later dismissed from command shortly after a failed attack on a British outpost at Le Collar Mills. He subsequently faced a court-martial on various charges of negligence and misconduct during the St. Lawrence campaign, but was exonerated. Lewis was retired, while Boyd was sidelined into rear area commands. Brown, Macomb, Ripley and Gaines were subsequently promoted. On the British side, Mulcaster was promoted to post-captain to take command of the frigate but lost a leg in 1814 during the raid on Fort Oswego, ending his active career. Morrison also was severely wounded later in 1814 at the Battle of Lundy's Lane. Morrison, Harvey and Pearson all eventually became generals, as did Major James B. Dennis, who commanded the militia which fought Brown at Hooples Creek. 12 rank-and-files survived to claim a Military General Service Medal in 1847 for serving at the battle, although others may not have bothered to do so.